Good. A warm welcome from my side to our first keynote in the IHED Conference 2022, which is jointly organized by the German Academic Exchange Service, better known as DAAD, and the Association of Indian Universities. We also have as a partner country this year on board France. So my thanks also go to the French Embassy of France in India and Campus France, who were supporting this international conference. This international conference is dealing with topics of internationalization. And we kicked off the conference this year with a topic which was highlighted in the National Education Policy of India 2 years back, but also in the intergovernmental consultation, which took place on Monday, actually, in Berlin, between the Indian Prime Minister and the Chancellor of Germany. And there it was stated that both governments welcome efforts at university level to explore collaboration between Indian and German universities, especially in the form of joint degrees and dual degrees. So this has found its way in the final declaration. I found it surprisingly and very interesting. The discussion on transnational education has had over the last 2 years in India focus on establishing campus by international universities in the country. But transnational education, as mentioned, does not stop there and includes a lot of other things. So I'm very glad that our keynote speaker, Kevin Cauter, accepted our invitation. He will give us an outlook on the concept of transnational education, the global trends, and also activities. Kevin is Principal Consultant Higher Education at the British Council. So here we have another addition to the international aspect of our conference, where he leads the British Council works on the areas of transnational education and higher education partnerships. He has advised on and developed higher education strategies for the British Council in over 30 countries, so indeed a real international expert. For 2 decades, Kevin has been regularly asked to author articles on UK, TNE, and student mobility, and has presented at conferences on the subject all over the world. Just to mention a couple of recent projects, they include the impact of transnational education on host countries, like from 2014. A more recent one would be TNE, a classification framework on data collection and guidelines, or a review on TNE in 6 countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. And a forthcoming research piece examining the value of transnational education beyond the economic. So thank you, Kevin, so much for accepting our invitation. Without further ado, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation. After your presentation, just would like to invite also our attendees to post their questions in the chat. We will have a couple of minutes for Q&A, so please post your comments and questions in the chat. And Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to DAAD and to AIU. It's a privilege to be speaking to you today about transnational education. So as has been said, my name is Kevin Van Cauter. I'm the Principal Higher Education Consultant at the British Council with a focus on transnational education and partnerships. I hope you all can see my slides. I'm sure someone will say if you can't. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 to 30 minutes to give you really an understanding of transnational education, to take you through some of the principles and concepts, to talk about the impact and value of transnational education, and then I'll plenty of time, hopefully at the end, to take any questions. So I'd just like to start by giving you a summary of the session. I'm going to talk about what is transnational education and why it's important, what are the trends in transnational education. I'm going to focus a little bit on what we know about UK transnational education, talk to you about what was mentioned in the introduction, a common framework to categorize different models of TNE, which I think will be a helpful framework to use to frame the discussion, and also to talk to you about what we understand the benefits and value of transnational education are to a range of different stakeholders, which I'll describe as I go through. So that's a summary of the session. I'm going to take mostly a UK perspective, but I will also bring in examples from other countries. Transnational education is a global phenomenon, and there are many countries who are either delivering or hosting transnational education programs. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction around the role of the British Council in supporting transnational education. So we work in 100 countries around the world, just over 100, working with stakeholders, contributing to policy and system level discussions and engagement, which enable transnational education partnerships. We work to increase the scale and scope of UK transnational education by assisting institutions in finding partners in specific countries, identified in the UK's international education strategy, of which India is one. To increase the number of students accessing UK transnational education, we also produce research and insights into global TNE trends, as well as national level reports and research. Now, all of these are available on the British Council's website, and at the end I'll give you information on how to access them. There are lots of different research reports which are available completely free from the British Council's website. And we work with other UK agencies and sector bodies and the government to deliver all of the above for the UK. So that's the role of the British Council in all this. Now, before we start going into a lot of detail, I think we need to be clear about the definition of TNE. Now, this is a definition from the OECD. It's quite an old one, but I think it's still quite relevant. And this describes higher education programs or sets of courses in which the learners are located in a different country from the one where the awarding institution is based. And that's the key concept. So it's basically a transnational education program is delivery of education by one country to students directly in another country who are located in another country. So that's the broad definition, and this covers lots of different models, which I'll go through in a moment. But I think it's worth setting out the sort of global context around the growth in transnational education, because transnational education has seen significant growth globally in the last, particularly in the last 10 years, but also in the last over a longer period. And I think the main drivers of this are increasing demand for higher education globally, with challenges on how to fund this at the scale and quality demanded. So in many countries, there is just a lack of capacity, and transnational education supports more students accessing international higher education. Obviously, there's a greater role for technology, and students are looking to learn anytime, anywhere, and transnational education supports that because many of the models involve blended learning, online learning, and different ways of accessing the content. There is globally more emphasis on internationalization and increasing student and researcher mobility. Greater emphasis on employability and entrepreneurship of graduates. This is really crucial because for TNE programs, many of them have this as a focus, so are really supporting the employability of graduates and also instilling entrepreneurship skills and embedding them within their programs. There is increased competition for international students, and we obviously live in an uncertain world given the impact of the UK leaving the EU, which still hasn't been fully played out, and the pandemic. All of these things are contributing to a growth or in demand and supply of international education, specifically transnational education. But I think it's worth saying right at the beginning that for the UK, there has been a paradigm shift in the way UK higher education is delivered to international students. Now, there's a few statistics there, but I think that the key point is that now there are more students. So if there are more international students taking UK programs in their home country than there are international students coming to the UK to study. So in other words, there are more students taking UK TNE programs than there are international students in the UK. So we have seen this huge shift in the way UK higher education is delivered to international students. Most students now who are accessing UK higher education do so through flexible delivery, through transnational education, or through joint and dual programs, all the different models. But there are huge numbers of students taking these types of programs now. And on current trends, about 2/3 of UK higher education international students will be on transnational education programs within the next 5 years. So we are seeing this huge shift, and I think it's the sector, the UK higher education sector, and all of our partner countries. We have to think about international higher education in a new way, and I think that's crucial when we're thinking about transnational education. And this just this graph just shows that trend very clearly. So the purpley line, the one that grows much higher, is the number of students on UK transnational education programs in total. And the other line, the bluer line, is the number of international students in the UK. So you can see the number of students on UK TNE programs has grown significantly, and the number of international students in the UK is relatively stable. So I think that really demonstrates that change. And this next graph just shows that just UK TNE students. And we do have, when we look at the data, there are some anomalies with some very large providers. So we've just stripped those out here, but just to show the growth in numbers. So there are about 370,000 students taking UK transnational education around the world. That was in 2019, the last year which we have data, and the growth has been about the same levels in the last couple of years. So it's been huge growth, but I think we need to think about this in the context of how that growth is managed, and I'm going to talk about that as I go through the presentation. So just to give an overview of UK transnational education, just to summarise this section, there's been a very large growth in TNE programmes from the UK. I think there's an increasing role in transnational education contributing to host countries' national priorities, so where the programmes are delivered. Very much we're looking at ways of supporting the priorities of the country, higher education priorities of the country where the programmes are delivered. So from a UK perspective, we want to understand, and some of these things were said in the introduction, the kind of what the country who we're partnering with, what are their key subject areas, what types of programmes are they looking to deliver, what are the models which are best suited to that particular country. All of these things become part of the equation when thinking about transnational education. There is definitely a trend towards a more partnership-led model. I think going back probably 10 or 20 years, it wasn't necessarily the case, but I think transnational education has evolved to be much more about collaboration and partnership in recent years. As we mentioned, joint and dual awards, joint curriculum development, joint delivery are all much more significant now in the models that are being used in transnational education. More research-led universities are engaging in TNE. Again, I mentioned in the introduction the desire of India to work with the top 1,000, I think it was, global universities. So many more of the research-led universities, particularly in the UK, are now engaging in transnational education. So Russell Group universities, for example, all have or most of them now have quite significant transnational education engagement. I mentioned the development in host countries. I think increasingly, again, I think this was mentioned in relation to Germany as well, but in the UK, we're seeing TNE being part of institutional institutional internationalization strategies. So I think a similar percentage of UK universities as German ones, 80 or 90%, have an international strategy. And transnational education is increasingly being seen as a significant part of those internationalization strategies. So universities are putting TNE right up there in their strategic plans. And I think, again, that means that there's more attention being paid to quality, to long-lasting partnerships which are developing beyond the transnational education programme into other areas such as joint research, for example. And universities are being more strategic in deciding how and with whom they partner. So I've talked a lot about some of the background here. Just to give you a sense of the different models, there are many different models and modes of transnational education. Now this slide, and I'll bring everything up all at once because there's so many different names and types of TNE. This just gives you a sense of the types that we're considering here. There are a lot of models. Some of them are more about partnership than others. The validation and franchise models are probably not as significant now. They were more significant, I think, about a decade ago. These are where programs are delivered directly by an institution in another country without really very much development or contextualization. So this model doesn't necessarily work in all countries. And I think, as I mentioned, we're very much looking at working with the partner country to understand which models are likely to succeed best in a particular country and environment. And I think for India, as has already been mentioned, the joint award is a significant one, where the award is given jointly by 2 or more higher education institutions, or dual awards, double awards. There are models around in-country or flying faculty, as we call it, where where professors and lecturers will go out and deliver lectures in particular countries or locations as part of the model. There's all of the distance learning programs which are included within the definition of transnational education. There are blended models with different e-learning, online learning, face-to-face learning, a mix of different models. And then, of course, there's the overseas campus, which again has been mentioned. It's worth saying, though, that from a UK perspective, the majority of programs are validation, franchise, or joint or dual award, and distance learning. Overseas campuses make up a very small percentage of the total number of transnational education programs delivered by the UK. I think it's under 20%. So under 20% of students globally who are taking UK TNE programs are studying at a campus. So over 80% are studying through one of these other models. And I think when we talk about models and which models are suitable, I think that the ones where there is much more of a collaborative, sorry, I just got a message on my screen, where they're more collaborative, are much more popular, smaller scale, but more intensive partnership arrangements, which, as I said, often strategically a TNE program is something which is designed to lead to other types of partnerships, which may be mobility of researchers and students, which may be additional joint research programs, or bidding for funding for external research funding on the back of a joint program. All of these things need to be taken into account, and where we're talking about strategic partnerships, it's more the models are more around the sort of more collaborative ones. But just so it's clear that that transnational education and all the figures that I've been using refers to all of these models. You know, there are lots of different models, and they're all as valid as each other. And I think the other thing to say is that from a UK perspective, again, all of these models deliver programs which are quality assured to the same standard. So the UK Quality Assurance Agency manages the quality assurance of UK transnational education, is responsible for that, and it assesses universities and the quality of the programs based on its criteria. Just move to the next slide if I can. Seems to be stuck. Okay. My screen is stuck. Just one second. Apologies. Ah, there we go. Okay, so just to summarize the context, and some of these things I've already mentioned, but I think it's worth just coming back to those and saying that it's very much about increasing demand, the role of technology, particularly in distance learning. I think it's also important when we're looking at where programs are being delivered, there are a set of enabling factors, if you like, which need to really be in place in order for transnational education partnerships to develop, and the enabling factors which allow TNE to flourish. And we just listed some of them there. Some of them are demographic, some are related to the systems in place and the policy environment. And I think with India, obviously, given the new government legislation, we feel now there's the enabling policy environment is much more favourable, with the potential for a lot more TNE partnerships. And I think I would agree that in a year's time we will hopefully see many partnerships with not just the UK, but with lots of other institutions working with partners in India. But I think it's worth thinking about the kind of the enabling factors for TNE, because you need the right types of population, the right audience, the right level of English to deliver these programs. And I think India now has a lot of these enabling factors in place. So that's, in a sense, a summary of TNE, the models, the scale from a UK perspective. We've also been doing a lot of work at the British Council looking at, why are we doing TNE? What are the benefits of TNE to the various stakeholders? What's the value of transnational education? Because a lot of anecdotal evidence that TNE is very beneficial, that it supports national education systems, that it gives students more opportunities. but there's not been much in the way of evidence around this. So we've done some work over the last few years looking at the benefits of transnational education. And I think just to summarize that, the benefits of TNE to the institutions include reaching new students, diversifying education program delivery, and developing a quality or reputation for education provision. So often international partnerships deliver these things. There is some evidence that additional students who wouldn't be able to travel necessarily for whatever reason can access international education through TNE. It gives the option of diversifying the program delivery and the quality of the education provision. So I think there are some clear benefits there, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a bit more detail as I go through. And also, I think for students, crucially, we've surveyed students who are taking TNE programs to get an understanding of what they're looking for and what they get out of transnational education programs. And these are sort of global surveys that we've run. And these are the sort of real benefits that students say they're getting from transnational education. Ability to gain a more international outlook, to develop intercultural competence, to develop their analytical thinking skills, and that students feel that the teaching methods on TNE programs give them some of these skills and opportunities that are highly valued by both the students themselves and by employers. And again, we've done some surveys with employers in a range of countries, and they've also said that transnational education graduates tend to have the skills that they're looking for. These are more employability skills, which I mentioned earlier. So we can see here that TNE is developing these types of skills in students. There are benefits to the host country, so a country which is delivering the TNE programs. And these are very broad benefits, sort of categories, but in countries around the world, transnational education has increased access and enabled capacity building for institutions. It's had academic impacts, which are quite varied, and there are lots of those. Skills impacts in developing the particular skills that students need, and social cultural impacts in terms of intercultural competence. So we're starting to see sort of that transnational education can benefit institutions and countries on both sides, and it can deliver some of these national priorities. I think it's also worth saying that students, so this is a global view of transnational education students, but you've got some clear sort of motivations as to why they choose to take TNE programs. Career development is very important to them. They see TNE as a way to improve their professional skills and their career prospects, and that employers value the skills developed as a result of studying a TNE program. So again, in general, and this is a global study, but in general, we find that TNE students are very career motivated. And I think this is quite an interesting finding because it shows that TNE programs are delivering some of those skills that those students are looking for. Now, I just wanted to pause it and just think a little bit about some of the research that we've done on transnational education over the last decade, and to give you a sort of a very quick summary of some of the key findings around some of these things to do with benefits and impact of transnational education. Now, we've done some of this work in collaboration with the DAAD over the years. I've worked with DAAD and some of their research team, and we've produced some joint reports and research in some of these areas. So it's great to be speaking at DAAD organised events about some of this. We've run research and always we've taken a stakeholder perspective. So we've looked at students, partners, institutions to try and get a sense of their views of transnational education. This is just a list of some of the research. We looked at TNE students, the evolution of transnational education, the impacts. We looked at data collection. We did a classification framework. All of these research reports, as I say, are available online, and I'm happy to share links later. So you can look at those. But I think, as I said, we've always taken a host country perspective, that is a country where TNE is being delivered. I think it's interesting thinking about how TNE is developed in some of the more mature countries where TNE has been delivered for many years, particularly, for example, Malaysia or the UAE. And it's interesting how in those countries TNE has had a very significant impact on on the system, higher education system and national higher education system, and also on institutions. So it's improved the quality of higher education, and there's some evidence to support that. It's attracted international students, increasing professional qualifications, developed a skilled workforce. And in many countries, transnational education is a significant alternative to traditional international student mobility or even domestic higher education. Now, there's some examples there of where TNE accounts for quite a large share of higher education provision. So, for example, in Hong Kong or Malaysia, 15% of all higher education is delivered through TNE. And in some of those smaller countries in Africa, it's an even larger percentage. So you can see that, apologies, I've got some background noise. Hopefully you can hear me. So TNE can account for a large share of higher education provision in some countries. So it really is increasing capacity in higher education in countries where that's the imperative and that's the driver. So just to summarize the findings of kind of all of this research really in a few bullet points, I think we surveyed stakeholders and in general they were optimistic about transnational education and the future of transnational education. In most countries, and we spoke to stakeholders in a dozen countries, the number of programs and capacity of existing programs is expected to expand. Transnational education looks well placed to assist in development of local knowledge economies and could lead to more collaborative research. Overall, people felt that the positive attributes and impacts of TNE were significant. Students, I've mentioned that students are very much accessing TNE programs in order to improve their career prospects. But I think a key finding is that there isn't really very much data. And this is something which I showed you some graphs at the beginning giving the sort of UK numbers. There's very little data out there. I know the DAAD publish data on their transnational education and the German side, but there's no global database of transnational education, unlike international student mobility, where there are very significant global sort of data sets. And I think that does mean it's quite difficult to sometimes to analyze and research TNE. It's something that we've been looking at. So I just wanted to sort of again summarize the benefits. And I think I've covered most of these points. I just wanted to re-emphasize the benefits of TNE to students in particular, and some of the skills they're looking for. We've also spoken to employers in a few countries where TNE is well established. And in general, TNE students are employable. This is just really to give a sense of the employers, saying that from their perspective, TNE students bring some unique skills that are different from graduates from local institutions and different from graduates who have studied internationally. So I think there's definitely a feeling that TNE students have, they've developed an international outlook. They have through international study methods and programs and new ways of learning, but they've also maintained the local connections, maintained the local knowledge, and it's a blend of those which employers value. So I think just getting towards the end and just to summarize, the outlook for transnational education in general, and this is from our stakeholder surveys, the benefits outweigh the risks. In host countries, stakeholders were generally optimistic. And I think there's definitely a positive view in terms of outlook for transnational education. I would say that we're seeing, steady growth. I've talked a lot about the UK, but obviously Germany has significant transnational education, quite a different model, but quite well established overseas campuses. There's also significant transnational education being delivered by Australia. China is involved in TNE. There are many countries involved in transnational education, and all have slightly different models. But I think overall, particularly a lot of the global outlook applies to all forms of transnational education and all countries that are delivering it. I've mentioned a couple of times the issue of data and the classification framework that the British Council developed in partnership with the DAAD. This was launched in 2017, and this just is a summary of the work we did. We developed a common classification framework for TNE, really so that it was easier to understand the different models. We spoke to policymakers in about 30 different countries, and we worked also with OECD and UNESCO looking at trying to establish our framework. We're still working on that, but I think the principle is that in order to understand transnational education, everyone globally has to be using the same language. So we did develop this framework, and again, that's available online for free from either DAAD or British Council. Sorry, I just skipped a few slides there, but I think one other thing which I think is very important is TNE can represent in some ways a new model of learning. It's a blended model with flexible delivery. For students who are looking for an experience of studying locally but having an international outlook, and I think it can support increased access. So I think there's an argument to say that transnational education does represent a new model of learning, but grounded in the traditions and the quality of traditional higher education delivery. Now we haven't got, I'd like to leave time for questions. I've just got a couple of examples here of work we've done in other countries. It's worth maybe quickly just covering this because I think it's quite an interesting couple of interesting case studies. We've worked in the Philippines to develop UK transnational education partnerships. Now, in that country, there were no transnational education, or there was no transnational education when we started. We worked very closely with the Commission of Higher Education in the Philippines to develop guidelines, to develop a partnership program, and provide some funding for 20 new partnerships between UK and Philippine universities. It's a very successful program. I think it shows how working in collaboration with national agencies, with universities in another country, enables these TNE partnerships to develop. And the British Council, along with DAAD, who work in a similar way, supports these types of programs and initiatives to increase the number of partnerships. So just to summarize, I think transnational education is evolving. I think 2 decades ago, there were concerns about quality, but today TNE is much more likely to be a positive choice for students, made on an understanding that the quality of transnational education has improved significantly in the last decade. I think for many countries and for many students, TNE is seen as high quality. Recognition by employers is important, and the skills which are delivered are recognised as being those that really support employability. So I think, while over the decades that I've been working on TNE, I have seen this shift. The quality assurance of TNE, from a UK perspective anyway, is very strong. The Quality Assurance Agency has a significant role there, and they've really worked hard with institutions to ensure that the quality has improved over the last 10 years or so. And I think, crucially, for students, transnational education is seen as a positive choice, and students feel that the quality and recognition of the degree is a significant factor in why they choose TNE. So that's my last slide. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I've given you a good overview of transnational education, and I'm happy to take now questions for the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin, for showing us in 30 minutes all your research. Especially interesting, I found also the framework and then the different models of TNE, and you know that Germany and the UK have a bit of a different approach and a couple of things. Before we go to the questions of the audience, I would like to pose one question to you. So you mentioned the UK experience, and students would like to have the experience. Now, how would goes that along in transnational education if you study in a campus abroad, as the UK providers have a lot of campuses? So how you deliver this UK experience while studying in a campus in the Philippines, for instance?
Interesting question. Yes, I think it's a mixture of things. It's the teaching and learning. So whether it's delivered by UK academics or those that have been trained. The delivery is done in a based on the UK system in many cases. So that's one way. So students are experiencing UK education. The campuses where they're developed have are very much international in many cases. So the experience is having students from many other countries who are studying in those institutions. Sometimes we have UK students who spend a year abroad in those campuses. So as much as done as possible to give that experience. It's not exactly the same, but it's you know, at least in terms of the classroom experience is as similar as possible. And also some of the campus design is very similar to designs in the UK.
Okay, I think we have another question from Nitra here, and I think it's quite interesting, tuition fees. Now, what is the tuition fee structure of the program? Is it adjusted to the local structures? Are these programs as expensive as programs in the UK? So why don't you stay in the country? And what are the limitations with regarding to tuition fees?
Okay, so they are based on they will be adjusted. So it is always cheaper than studying in the UK. That's the first thing to say. It's not necessarily as cheap as local institution study, but the fees are set to be sort of in between. So in a sense, so it's less expensive than study abroad, but it's not necessarily as cheap as local study. So it's very much set within that context, but it is certainly a much cheaper way to access international education than to study overseas. But it depends on the local context. So it will vary country to country.
You see that the tuition fees were imposed by the government. I think the question comes from the background that the Indian government has a strong handhold on tuition fees and how much fees one can charge for programs, or are these providers completely free in their structure? So what is the experience maybe in the Philippines or other countries?
Yes, that depends on the local regulation. So in India, I don't know what the regulations are, I'm afraid, but where the fees are set in consultation with local authorities. In some countries, I think it is that there were no restrictions. In other countries, there will be caps on fees. So it depends on the local country and the host environment. But in general, the fees were set as low as possible to enable, you know, the course to attract students, because obviously the institutions need to cover their costs, but they have to set the fee at a level which, you know, is manageable in that context.
Thanks so much for that answer. I have here a question I think is quite interesting with regard to the distribution. So there's always, we talk about a lot of students with technical backgrounds. You've talked about employability as one of the major concerns, and to providing a more skilled workforce. So when we look at transnational education, apart from students from technical background, is there any hopeful opportunities for language students and researchers, as asking Sudipta? So how is the segregation look like? Is there a strong focus on technical education, or are we see also other TNE models in other subject fields?
There are other models, absolutely. I think just because the majority of the programs currently delivered tend to be in those kind of employment-focused areas, but that's not to say there are not other examples. And I think particularly where we're looking at smaller scale joint and dual programs, they would tend to be more focused on whether it's arts, language, or subjects like engineering, more technical, but not necessarily employment focused areas. So there are lots of examples of that, but I think where the programs are kind of large scale, they tend to be focused on business, computing, and those kind of areas, but not exclusively.
There's a question related to distance learning, which I find really interesting. So the question was, do you have seen programs where a complete degree was offered online? Or is there, you mentioned there's a focus sometimes on blended learning, or how is the tendency? And did you see some shifts also over the last 2 years? Now with the pandemic, everybody is more engaged into digital. We've all learned a lot what is possible digitally. So are there models which are purely digital? And are these probably increasing due to the developments which we have seen over the last 2 years?
Yes, so there are lots of options which are purely digital, but it depends on the country where we're delivering them, whether it's possible. So where it's possible within our education legislation. There are lots of purely online digital programs available. There are some very large-scale providers from the UK who offer programs fully online, like the University of London, the Open University, and some other big programs run by institutions like Leicester or Edinburgh, all fully online. But obviously for students, students will have to be aware whether those programs are recognised, because in many countries they're not recognised by the local higher education legislation. But in general, the trend is to a much more blended type of model. So a lot of the TNE programs shifted to online only during the pandemic and are now much more blended than they were previous to the pandemic, with a lot more lectures now online. Students have the flexibility to access from home if they need to. Absolutely, we're seeing that change. That's happening also in domestic delivery in the UK, where most lectures are now online right across the sector, and students have the option of attending classes or watching online. So I think that's definitely been a trend in TNE as well.
So that leads me to the last question, probably. So we have a question from a smaller university here, from the rural area.
Okay.
And the participant was wondering, how is it for smaller universities? So is TNE, and you mentioned quality and concerns of quality, is TNE something you see more developed with larger entities, be it in the UK or in also abroad, or is there also scope for cooperation in TNE projects for smaller rural universities, which are maybe a bit far away from the from the academic centers?
Yes, absolutely. So the partnerships with all kinds of institutions globally are running TNE programs, from very large to very small institutions. So absolutely, it all depends on the match of, so the academic match, whether the programs are similar and that the institution offers the same types of programs. But if it's it can be in niche subject areas. It's just a matter of finding the right partner. And I think the database, which was mentioned earlier, will help with that. And also, through the British Council, we can hopefully, if it's a UK partner you're looking for, we could try and help you find a match within institutions. So yes, absolutely, there are opportunities for smaller institutions to work with partners in the UK and other countries.
Thanks so much. We are getting more questions, and I think maybe we take them up a bit later. So thanks so much, Kevin, for this wonderful insight. I have to say I learned a lot. As I said, we also from the German side are looking. You mentioned that we are working closely together with British Council on these TNE projects. I personally look forward to the international database, I have to say, to get a better understanding and learning. And I think, Northern India is on its way opening up. I think a very relevant topic, and thanks for opening up this discussion. So a lot of greetings to you over to the UK. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll meet again, and then you present a study on India. Let's see in the next couple. I thank so much our audience for the wonderful questions which you posted and for the interest in this session. It remains for me to announce that we now head into a 15 minutes break in the conference for those who would like to attend other sessions. We continue the conference in 2:30 Indian time. No, not 2:30. 2:45 Indian time and 11:15 German time. We will have a session on equity and access, enabling international education for all. And we will have a session on rankings, improving quality of higher education. So please go to the program. If I messed up the timing now, please have a look. 15 minutes break. The sessions will take place parallelly. We are having in total 6 speakers who will present on the topics. We are looking forward to that. And thanks again, Kevin, for joining and for setting the framework also a bit with a larger context, looking into the world and into the UK. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
No, he left.